Hello. So today I'll be showing a quick intro to events in JavaScript and how you could use those with D3 and with Plotly. So just to kind of anchor what we're looking to do within environments that we're already using, we are going to be doing something similar to what we have happening um, in our Shiny apps. So using our toy example here, we essentially what we're looking for is action similar to this, where there's a function that we've tied to a drop down, and if you Shiny does this automatically, but if you think about what's actually happening on the back end, there's you could think that there is a function that's kind of laying in wait, and when you um, when you initiate an event, in this case, when you choose something from the dropdown, that function activates and uses that value. So here, it's laying in wait. It's not doing anything until we choose something from the dropdown. And Shiny does a really good job at abstracting a lot of this away. But with JavaScript, you are pretty much kind of working with these manually. So and just to sort of see, like when we're running those, we have our UI, and then we kind of have our functions here re-rendering when we're changing inputs. So for this, for Shiny, that's how you're defining it. But for JavaScript, you have to sort of manually define those. Now, with Shiny, because it's abstracted, it's a lot easier to build apps that are actually pretty complex to do within JavaScript. So in something like this, we actually have a client side and a server side. So when you're using these dropdowns, you're actually going to the server side, retrieving some new data, and bringing that back to your graph. And with the sorts of visualizations that that you guys will be working with in JavaScript, um, I'd say it's most of the time you're going to be remaining within the client side and essentially filtering and making changes to the data within your app. And that's actually the main driver behind why tools like this were created, is that it allows you to very easily go to the server side and access the tools that you have in R. In the case of something like Flask, the tools that you have within Python, and essentially run do complex calculations. So here, having the power of R and being able to run run your models, make a change based on a user input using the full power of R. But in terms of JavaScript, we're going to be kind of working with kind of simpler in kind of a simpler sort of world. So to start out, I'll be using Plotly, which will make it a bit easier to kind of understand what's going on with the graphs. I won't go through sort of the basics of building Plotly charts. I'll probably put together, next week I'll put together another video going through the different JavaScript libraries and how they kind of integrate with their services. But for now, I'll just essentially leave you guys to check out plot.ly/JavaScript if you want to delve more into what's happening when we're building the charts. So right now we're focusing mainly on events and how to use them to perform functions. So if you just go here, you'll see as you scroll down, just different plot types that you're able to work with. So let's get started here. So similar to what we were using in our simple examples, we're using this get element by ID to access an empty div. And the first thing that we're doing is we're going to be populating that div with a Plotly chart. So here I'm defining the two parts of a Plotly graph, the data and layout. So you can see my data specs, data is an array, and the layout specs, in this case just a title, and that's JSON. And then when I run plotly plot, I'm bringing in that div and just plotting my data and layout. And if I do that, I end up with something like this. So very simple page. I just have a plotly graph there that comes with its sort of standard interactivity. So to get started with events, we're going to begin looking at sort of different ways that you could manipulate graphs. So we'll start with the something more similar to the example that we were looking at before, where you have a drop down and you're sort of making changes. So the first thing that we'll do is just create that dropdown. So here, this is the code that's creating a dropdown that's choosing different color values. So here, you're basically having everything nested within this select object here, and you're choosing different options. And one thing to note is you have this in the middle, which is the text that shows up in the dropdown. And we're going to be referencing this later, but this is the one of the attributes of the option, and this is the value. So you could, so there is, this means that it is possible to have different values for what shows up in the dropdown and what that dropdown actually uses as its input. So when we go back to our page here, we'll see that the dropdown shows up, but at the moment we didn't tie it to anything. So right now it's kind of just a useless dropdown, and we're going to have to do some work to use that. And before I get into that, I want to sort of just talk a bit about events in general, because in this case, it's more clearly shown by events with the Plotly graph itself. So one of the pages here in this JavaScript page is the event reference. And what we'll be using today is event reference and function reference. I'll get to that in a bit, but these are the two sort of subsections that we're using from the main JavaScript reference. And if I look at the event reference, you could see that Plotly.js as a library, it comes with its own functions, and it also comes with its own events that users have access to. So you could see things like Plotly click, Plotly hover, and this Plotly relayout is actually deals with zooming. So you could see the different types of events there, and this gives you a rough framework of what we'll be doing. So we're accessing the graph div, and this .on is really where the kind of analogous situation to what we've been doing with Shiny, where an action is occurring when when something happens, and this is an event listener in JavaScript. So with Shiny, we have our inputs and it's abstracted away, but we're essentially saying when this input element is changed, perform this function and replot whatever we're looking at. When we do it within JavaScript, we have to specifically find out what that event is going to be, and using this .on, kind of tie that event to into doing something. So this is kind of the rough framework. And what we'll be doing with the plotly plot is something very simple, just console logging what's coming out. So in the page here, the function was blank, but one thing that comes with a lot of events, and you'll be noticing this, it's very specific to the different types of events that you're working with. A lot of times there's associated data with a particular event. Now the way to think of something like this is if we're capturing a click event, we may be interested in some information about that click event. We may want to know like what the XY location of that particular click. And for plotly click, it's specifically referring to clicking on a data point. So when so with something like this, we're using that graph div. So GD, I define that up here by get element by ID, and we're just using a particular event. So in this case, it's a plotly click, and and then the form, it's the event that we're accessing and the function that we're running. And if there is data with it, the data is an argument of that function. So we're calling that function, and all we're doing is console logging the data. So once we've made that change, we could just reload the page and see what ends up happening. So as I mentioned before, the clicks are referring to clicks of data points. So hovering over these, and if I click, we can now look at our console to see what ended up happening. And this object was returned, so we could check out what it is. Here, we could look at different aspects of that object. So we could see we have aspects of the graph itself. We have the X and Y coordinates, and we could access all of those if we wanted to use them for other functions. So if you are building a complex app, you could actually use a graph not just as an output, like what's being controlled by a dropdown, but also as input. And I believe I mentioned that on a previous video, where you make a click, you're accessing some part of the data behind the point that the user clicked on, and you could use that to perhaps update another chart or perform whatever function you would like. So that's how events work with Plotly. And what we'll do next is take a look at events and the drop-down menu. So here what I'm doing is using D3. I'm using plotly.d3, and if you are using Plotly, D3, like Plotly is built on top of D3, so it has access to all of the D3 functionality if you just use it in this way. But if you're using raw D3 or another library such as NVD3, then you would be able to just simply use D3.select. So just remove the Plotly, it's going to be the same. And in this case, we're using the same kind of select notation, but and then once we do that, that's similar to the this get element by ID. So what we're doing right now is we're selecting the dropdown. So selecting that by ID. For D3, we have this, we're using slightly different notation. We have this hash in front of it. And so we're selecting dropdown. And then we're adding this something similar where we have this this right here, this dot on, and we're performing a function. And I just commented this out. We're going to get to that in a sec, but I just wanted to first show show what we're doing here. So we're going to do something similar to before, just console logging what gets returned when we make a change to the dropdown. And you could see the way that we're accessing that is by this right here. So d3.event.target.value. And this value is referring to this attribute here. So that's what I mentioned before. That's why it's important to keep that separate from what you have here, or to make sure that you define that. So we're accessing that value, and when we refresh the page now, this is pretty much expected. What what we would get. You have your dropdown, you're selecting your values, and that's just being console logged here. So you're able to access the value of that dropdown and use that to make a change to something that you would like to do. So here we could just use this color to change the color of the markers here. And for that, what we're doing is we're using a built-in Plotly function. So in this case, what's called Plotly restyle. And once again, the information on that is found in the main page here. So don't know if it's on this link here, but if you go back to the main page and see the sidebar, you'll see the Plotly function reference on the left-hand side. So here, this is the function reference. And you could see different functions and different elements of Plotly, and this gives you a bit about events as well. So I'll let you guys read through this, but basically restyle, that lets us change any sort of anything about the data. So restyle is what you would use if you wanted to change the values. So if you were doing something that was more similar to the Shiny app and you wanted to sort of filter a CSV, this is the function that you would use. And if you wanted to change things like the overall layout of the chart, then you would use what's called relayout. So in this case, where and I'm using just this notation here where marker.color, so it's marker.color. You're able to refer to a specific node in a JSON in that way. And that's very useful for these sorts of functions in Plotly. And when you look at marker.color, we're just doing the same thing that we did here. So we're restyling the marker color with this particular value. And just a note, one thing I didn't add here is restyle lets you define what trace you're doing the restyle to. So if you define nothing, it'll do it to all traces. And but in this case, I only have one trace, so it doesn't matter. And just for good measure, I'll get that commented out. So now when we look at our toy example here, you'll see that we're just recoloring the marker points based on the drop down. So when I do that, you can see that's getting restyled. So that's a fairly simple example. For the discussion will be optional. It is late in the week, so and next week you guys have vacation. So feel free to take that full time to add something. But the discussion will be an optional sort of mini assignment where just use this as a jumping off point and make some tweaks to it. So if you do want to change some other aspect of the plotly graph, you could do that. If you do want to play around with different types of HTML controls, so here I have these. I mentioned W3 schools. That's a pretty nice resource. They'll you have drop downs to show you how to do that. And then here, this is just an example of something like buttons. So with buttons, the syntax is slightly different. You're not really using D3 because everything is contained within the button. So that's one example. This is all HTML. So using techniques that we did that we were using before, you can add these options from, you could have that be informed from the CSV. So I actually have a Plotly kind of reworking of a larger example here. So I actually don't have that locally. I'll post another example of something that sort of uses sort of D3 to dynamically add options here. But that's another thing to think about in terms of what you're able to do. And in terms of further reading, the chapter 9 in the interactive data visualization goes into these sorts of events. So again, I would sort of use this more in sort of a reference style rather than reading through entire chapters. But I believe it was right here with updating data where it gets into sort of the event listeners information. So page 138. So I'll turn on those discussion boards now, and like I mentioned, they are optional. So feel free to use that, and that'll be in addition to homework 6, which will also be posted. Thank you.